case where the answer who is the culprit is not complicated at all. A case where things went to the extreme, haywire, completely out of control, affecting hundreds, thousands, multiple thousands of people, and it also bankrupted big businesses, which was in the news for a long time and actually is still in the news. Bernie Madoff, one of the most infamous figures in the history of corporate greed. How individuals like Madoff are able to manipulate entire systems for personal gain. While this fantastic publication covers much more, we'll focus on two specific phenomena aspects. Welcome back, everyone, to the next episode of The Mammoth in the Room. Nicholas Bocconi, CEO of Mammoth Leadership Sciences. Remember, last time we started to talk about corporate greed through the lens of evolution. And we split this reflection in half because it was important to discuss the matter on a broad level to set the stage. And we also wanted to give it a bit more time, as it is currently in the news everywhere. We're talking about corporate greed and profit-taking during and after the pandemic, when the pressure for the population, and I'm talking the normal population, not the billionaires, is the highest. We called out some of the system inefficiencies, which are difficult to decipher. And I said it's very complex to blame the profit-taking and profit-making on one particular culprit, be it a person, be it a corporation, be it society. It's very complex. And you know, the good thing is we don't have to solve this here. We let the macro and micro economists, the esteemed professors and scholars figure that out. But we also said, and we reiterated, that any business decision since the beginning of time, or businesses, until today, around the globe, 24/7, is nothing else than the manifestation of human behavior of the people who made these decisions. Which means every case of corporate greed has a human behavior of one or two, or maybe a few behind it. But it's never the corporation itself who decides to do that. It's always one or two or few people who do that. And today, like we promised, we'll continue with a real and clear-cut case, which was in the news for a long time and actually is still in the news every now and then. A case where the answer who is the culprit is not complicated at all. It's where corporate greed is at its best. In fact, it's the epitome, the embodiment, the literal personification of corporate greed. A case where things went to the extreme, haywire, completely out of control, with a huge negative spillover to normal day life, affecting hundreds, thousands, multiple thousands of people, and it also bankrupted big businesses. And you know, in these situations where leaders completely misuse the power they have been given, that's where neuroscience, evolutionary science, behavioral science, biology and psychology comes in and provide answers, at least some of them. And that is literally the sweet spot of the podcast and why we have this podcast. And we will now explore this a bit on a case quite many people know, at least heard something about. We explore this case, and then at the end, we'll reflect on it, what to do about it. Bernie Madoff, one of the most infamous figures in the history of corporate greed. He ran the largest Ponzi scheme ever recorded, defrauding investors of billions of dollars over decades. Madoff's actions weren't just criminal, they also provide a stark example of the failures in leadership that can arise when unchecked greed and psychological biases come into play. To give you a bit of a background, Bernie Madoff was a former chairman of Nasdaq and a highly respected figure on Wall Street. He founded his own investment firm, which was supposedly offering clients consistent and high returns. For years, Madoff maintained an image of a successful, trustworthy financial advisor. His firm was so reputable that investors, including high net worth individuals, charitable organizations, and even other financial institutions, entrusted him with their money. But underneath this facade was a massive Ponzi scheme. Madoff wasn't actually investing his clients' money. Instead, he was using the funds from new investors to pay returns to earlier investors, creating the illusion of a profitable business. This worked as long as more money kept coming in, but the scheme was designed to collapse, and collapse it did. In 2008, when the financial crisis hit and investors began demanding their money back. With billions of dollars in liabilities and no actual profits, Madoff's scheme unraveled, leaving thousands and thousands of investors in financial ruin. Madoff's story isn't just about a single individual's greed and dishonesty. It's also a story about the psychological and social mechanism that allowed such behavior to go unchecked for so long. How did a man like Madoff rise to such heights of power and influence? Why did so many people trust him without question? And what does this tell us about the nature of leadership and followership? To answer these questions, we again turn to evolutionary psychology, specifically the work we already have mentioned multiple times, the work of Mark van Vugt and Richard Jonay. Their 2014 paper, The Evolutionary Psychology of Leadership, Theory, Review and Roadmap, offers a framework to understand how individuals like Madoff were and are able to manipulate entire systems for personal gain. While this fantastic publication covers much more, we'll focus on two specific phenomena aspects. One, evolved cognitive biases, and two, evolved psychological mechanisms for dominance. Let's start with cognitive biases underlying leaders' selection and decision making. According to the authors, these biases are the result of evolutionary pressures that shaped how we chose leaders and how those leaders make decisions. In the distant past, leadership was about survival. Who could lead the hunt, protect the group, and handle immediate threats? Traits like charisma, dominance, and maybe physical strength were crucial because they directly impacted the group's chances of survival. Fast forward to modern times, and we find that these traits are still influencing how we select leaders, even though the demands of leadership have evolved significantly. Charisma, for example, is often equated with competence. But as we'll see in Madoff's case, charisma can sometimes mask unethical behavior. So let's talk about the charismatic leadership bias. Madoff was a master of charismatic leadership. He exuded confidence and charm, and he had an uncanny ability to project an image of competence and success. In our evolutionary past, a charismatic leader who could command attention and inspire trust was likely to be an effective leader. In small tribal societies, this kind of leadership was about direct action, leading the hunt, defending against threats, and making quick, decisive decisions. With, as we discussed in episode 7 about leadership and followership, immediate KPI check. No risk. Pretenders couldn't make it. If the ship sank, you were out. But in the complex world of modern finance and corporate governance, from evolutionary time perspective, which goes back millions of years as hominins, basically in the last 25 seconds, charisma can sometimes become a tool for deception. Madoff's charisma made people believe in him without questions. There is no immediate KPI check. His investors, many of whom were sophisticated and experienced investors, they trusted him, not because they had thoroughly vetted his business practices, but because he had an aura of success and authority. And this bias towards charismatic leadership can blind us to the reality of leaders' actions. We equate charisma with competence. But this isn't always the case, and Madoff's charisma allowed him to command attention, project authority, but also enabled him to manipulate people and exploit their trust. This is a prime example of how our evolved preference for charismatic leaders can lead us astray in a modern context. Then, let's talk about short-term versus long-term gain bias. Another cognitive bias that played a role in Madoff's rise and fall is a preference for short-term rewards over long-term sustainability. In evolutionary terms, immediate rewards were crucial for survival. In times of scarcity, grabbing what was available now could mean the difference between life and death. Our ancestors had to prioritize immediate gains to ensure their survival. And even when I look at myself, there is this one stock which is supposed to go up over the next few weeks because of whatever. And I'm thinking, should I pull some funds from one of my long-term steady investments to make a quick short-term gain, basically gambling? The urge is there. Does this sound familiar? Or am I the only one? In the modern world, this tendency can be destructive, especially in leadership roles. Madoff's entire scheme was built on short-term thinking. He created an illusion of consistent returns to lure in investors, but there was no real sustainable business model behind it. His focus was on accumulating as much money as possible in the short term, without regard for the long-term consequences. And this is a common problem in corporate leadership. Leaders who prioritize short-term gains, whether it's inflating stock prices, cutting corners to boost profits, or in Madoff's case, running a Ponzi scheme, can cause immense harm to their organizations and to society at large. In Madoff's case, the consequences were catastrophic, leading to financial ruin for thousands of people. And it's also system-generated. You need to hit the next quarter targets, don't you? And if you don't and miss them, and then tell the street that because of this miss you'll outperform your overarching year or 3-year target, does that work? Well, good luck with that strategy. The second phenomenon we discuss is psychological adaptations for dominance. So before we had the cognitive biases with a few examples, now we have the second phenomenon we discuss, it's psychological adaptations for dominance. As evolution works through the process of natural selection, every individual's reproductive success is always relative. We discussed that at length in the first 3 episodes of The Mammoth in the Room to lay the groundwork of the approach, right? Every trait of an individual is compared to other individuals with alternative traits. And as we established, that natural selection operates on variation between individuals, not on group level. You remember our suicidal lemmings in episode 2? One person's gain is often another person's loss when it comes to reproductive gain. And that means that humans have developed and hold still today psychological mechanisms designed to dominate and exploit others, ascend social hierarchies, and prevent rivals from achieving dominance. Again, the reference source is highly recommended. So let's talk about some of the tools we developed as humans to cope with that. One is resource accumulation and exploitation. Throughout human history, individuals who could control resources had an advantage. They could attract mates, provide for offspring, secure their status in the group. This drive to accumulate resources still exists. But in the corporate world, it often leads to exploitations rather than cooperation. Just think about yourself, or maybe somebody you know who has kind of everything, but still wants the next thing, the next journey, the next whatever, the next car, the next yacht, the next, I don't know, right? We are never really satisfied. It's all about getting resources. We all say we're not that kind of people, but at the end of the day, aren't we? Anyway, Madoff's case is a textbook example of this. He accumulated vast amounts of wealth at the expense of others, exploiting their trust and financial resources to build his own empire. This behavior taps into the evolutionary drive to control resources, but when taken to extremes, it becomes harmful to society. What's interesting about Madoff's scheme is that it wasn't just about money, it was about power and control. By accumulating wealth, he also accumulated influence and status, which further enabled him to manipulate others and maintain his scheme for as long as he did. The second part in this power play is Machiavellian leadership and manipulation. Machiavellian leadership is characterized by manipulativeness, by deceitfulness, by high levels of self-interest, and the tendency to see others as means to an end. Leaders with high Machiavellian traits are often skilled at navigating complex social environments to maintain power. They manipulate systems and people, often without concern for the greater good. Madoff's entire scheme was a masterclass in manipulation. He used deceit and charm to maintain his power and control over investors. He convinced people that he was a financial genius, even though his success was built on lies. This type of leadership might be effective in the short term, but is ultimately a recipe for disaster. Madoff didn't just deceive his investors. He deceived his own family, his employees, and the entire financial system. He used his position of power to manipulate others and externalize the costs of his actions. This is a classic example of Machiavellian leadership, where the leader is willing to exploit others for personal gain, regardless of the consequences. And what goes with this, with all of this, is social dominance orientation. Leaders with high social dominance orientation prefer hierarchical structures and believe that certain groups should dominate others. This preference is deeply ingrained in our evolutionary history, where social hierarchies often determine access to resources and mates. Always remember, all of the things developed over the, depending on the source, 4.5 to 6 million years going back in our evolution when we as hominins started to roam the world. What happens at this very moment, these corporate environments and the way how we organize ourselves, this is literally 25 seconds of this evolutionary journey. So you can imagine how this is ingrained in our evolution, in the way how we think, we feel in our brain. Madoff exploited hierarchical systems for personal gain. He established himself at the top of the financial hierarchy, leveraging his position to manipulate others. He created an environment where questioning his authority, heard about it, was almost unthinkable. His investors, many of whom were themselves part of the financial elite, believed in his authority partly because of the hierarchical structures within which he operated. This is a key point. Madoff didn't just exploit individual investors. He exploited the hierarchical nature of the financial system itself. By positioning himself as an authority figure, he was able to manipulate the system to his advantage, demonstrating how social dominance orientation can lead to unethical leadership practices. And finally, the most important of all, power and corruption. There's a very interesting saying, quoted expansively, and going back to John Emmerich Edward Dalbec Acton, the first Baron Acton, who wrote in 1887 in the letter to Bishop Mandell Crichton. He was a bishop of the Church of England in the very late 1900s. And this is what he said: power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Great men, he wrote, are almost always bad men. Wow! Evolutionary psychology suggests that once individuals attain power, they undergo psychological changes. They begin to feel invulnerable, which can lead to increased risk-taking and reduced empathy. Madoff's refusal to admit wrongdoing and his audacity to maintain the charade for so long suggests a belief that he was invulnerable, a hallmark of corrupting influence of power. He operated with a sense of impunity, believing that he could continue deceiving people indefinitely. This is yet another example of how unchecked power can lead to decisions that harm both individuals and society as a whole. When leaders like Madoff feel that they are above the law, they are more likely to engage in unethical behavior that has far-reaching consequences. Now, so we covered evolutionary history, psychology, and why these things all developed millions of years ago and still today. Now, what are we doing with all of these wisdoms? Because it's not just an academic exercise, right? Or it should not be just an academic exercise. Can we learn these things? Can we train them? Can we practice them? Well, here are my thoughts. I'm a big believer, a super big believer in knowing your shit. When you're a carpenter, you better know how to use your tools. When you're a sales rep, you better know your products inside out. When you're a lawyer, you better know the laws, etc., etc. And when you're a leader, you better know about leadership. So yes, knowledge is critical. For instance, knowing about these phenomena we discussed today. And that means, at least for me, that incorporating evolutionary biology and psychology into leadership training isn't just a way to prevent corporate greed and exploitation. It's a pathway to fostering more effective, empathetic, and responsible leaders for better business results. As we continue to evolve as a society, our understanding of leadership must evolve too, embracing these insights. So here are some of them. That some traits that were adaptive in our evolutionary past, like charisma or dominance, may not serve us well in today's complex organizations. That the show that gets you the job doesn't necessarily make you successful if you continue to show off when you started the role. That, when we select leaders, we do that rather based on their long-term vision, empathy, kindness, and ethical decision-making, and their ability to channel their ambitions toward cooperation, shared success, and the long-term health of the organization. I still remember in one of my big role jumps, I was in a very, very lengthy interview process. And I was brought into this interview process basically for learning. I was told at the beginning from a headhunter, you have no chance, but you will learn a lot. So long story short, for some reasons I could surprise everyone and I ended at the end with the job. But I still remember that one moment where I was interviewed, and I was interviewed from 3 people at the same time. I was sitting in the middle of the table. I was sitting at the desk, and then I had these 3 people, 1, 2, 3, one in front of me, one left, one right. And they were pressuring me to tell them when would I fire people? What would need to happen that I would fire people? And I was like, I don't want to fire people. But then the question was, but what if you need to? Where would you start? So I was basically put against the wall and had to at some point say, well, if I really have to fire people, these would be the reasons, that they are reckless and blah, 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 blah. So what that was a very senior management and interview panel checking out this new guy. If this is a guy who just, takes the employees as means for his own goals, or if he is reasonable. And I didn't even pretend anything. I was just like, I don't want to fire people. And I think that is super critically important, that we foster leaders who put the people in front of everything. That's the reason why we talk about all of this. So I think just being aware of all of this, learning and knowing more about it, and let leadership and followership decisions filter through this knowledge helps to create a better future for organizations and the people they serve. At least for everyone who embraces that. And I'm trying to contribute to that through the book, the podcast, and the conversations about it. So knowledge is important. But is it the most important factor? No, by far not. Because just knowing about the fact that you should not misuse your power does not equal to indeed not misusing the power you have once you have been granted that very power. I'm currently binge watching Those About to Die, the title going back to what the gladiators were asked to tell the emperors before they were allowed to fight to death. Morituri te salutant. Those about to die salute you. These Roman emperors were corrupt as hell. They declared themselves gods in order to stay on top of the social system. And not only the Roman emperors did that. I have committed a full chapter of my book, The Mammoth in the Room, to power, working backwards from the evolutionary roots of power, its relation to fear and how to manage it. And I'm very consciously saying manage it. Because if anyone thinks that any time ever in the human past, present or future, power and fear can be eradicated completely, I need to disappoint you and need to tell you, turn on the TV, read the news, look at your sports clubs, associations, churches, companies, universities, you name it. Power and fear and levels of it, depending on how it's managed, everywhere. Why? Because in any social system, per definition, more than one person doing something together, the behavior of creating hierarchical systems, leadership and followership, having someone who says what's going to happen and having others to follow, ensured survival over millions of years. And hierarchy and leadership and followership comes with power. Or did you watch or follow the TV series Vikings? I binged watched it and loved it. And I found 2 quotes of enormous wisdom in it, which I also quoted in my book. Ragnar Lothbrok, King of Sweden, said this about power. Power is dangerous. It corrupts the best and attracts the worst. And he also said, power is only given to those who are prepared to lower themselves to pick it up. So lower yourself, pick it up, carry it with grace. And don't you ever, never let it corrupt you, even if you feel on top of everything. Nothing in the world can teach you that. just live it. When you want to live up to the honor you've been entrusted, leading people. Thank you for tuning in today. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, rate, and share with anyone who's passionate about leadership. And lastly, if you're interested in more, you can order my book. It has the same title as this podcast, The Mammoth in the Room. It offers a practical roadmap how great leaders and their teams embrace evolutionary truths for outstanding business results. And it does it in 3 sections: on people, on strategy, and on implementation. Until next time, Nicholas Bocconi, The Mammoth in the Room.